Imagine the Great British Bake Off, but instead of soggy bottoms, we get crying judges, dogs wearing costumes, and a gentle cloud of mohair fluff. That's episode 2 of The Game of Wool. After the first episode, knitters had a lot to say about unrealistic time limits, a lack of historical context, and a Fair Isle vest challenge that was completely misaligned from Shetland knitting traditions. To their credit, the folks behind the show seem to actually be listening. Recently, Channel 4's Let's Get Knitting YouTube channel posted a video delving into the history and tradition and motifs of Fair Isle knitting. It's encouraging to see that they're trying to fill in the gaps and provide the content that a knitting audience would love to see. Episode 2, Icons Week, already feels more confident. The judging is more cohesive, the outfits are more wearable, and the challenges make a little more sense. So did Channel 4 actually fix the Game of Wool's biggest problems, or did they just put them on a dog and call it a day? The Game of Wool brings 10 amateur knitters to Scotland to compete in weekly solo and group challenges. Each week, one knitter is crowned Big Knitter of the Week and gets to wear the sheep badge, and one knitter is cast off, which is what they call being eliminated. Episode 2 is Icons Week, and the first challenge is to complete a 2-piece dog outfit, including headwear. The outfit must fit the dog properly, and it must incorporate knitting and crochet. It has to be inspired by an icon that's personal to you, a person or a place, and it has to be completed in 12 hours. As the episode opens, it's clear that even the styling this week is looking better. The judges, Di and Sheila, are wearing sweaters that Di designed and knit back in the 80s, which makes sense since the second challenge this week will be 80s inspired. And Tom is wearing a chunky showpiece, a big oversized sweater, and while it's bold and colorful, it's still cute and wearable. Following up from episode 1's chunky Fair Isle vest debacle, a dog sweater actually feels like an improvement. This is a garment that any hand knitter might actually make, so I was optimistic going into episode 1. And as a challenge brief, it makes a lot of sense. Many knitters have knit a human sweater, but it's less common to knit a sweater for a dog, so the shaping wouldn't be as intuitive for the participants in this show. You can't just knit a sweater on autopilot, you have to engineer it. The judges explained that each sweater has to include both knitting and crochet, which feels a little bit odd for a show with the tagline Britain's Best Knitter. It would be like if Forged in Fire had a glass blowing challenge because, well, you're heating something up in a hot oven, it's pretty much the same. The show has a pretty solid explanation of the difference between knitting and crochet, but then they throw this illustration up on screen, which looks suspiciously AI generated. It just feels odd for a show that's celebrating hand makers and crafts to use AI for an illustration and not hire a human illustrator. And this ties into a bigger pattern that we're starting to see across episodes 1 and 2 of the show. The people who are making Game of Wool are clearly not knitters. Their goal is to make entertaining TV and not necessarily to create a faithful or nuanced representation of the craft. Let's dive into the dog outfits created for this challenge because there were some genuinely innovative and creative ideas on display here, but they're also a helpful window into what's valued in the judging on the show. First, we see Lydia's Notting Hill Carnival-inspired sweater. Lydia describes what lace knitting is, and I was refreshed to see even the slightest bit of technical explanation on this show. It felt like an improvement from last week. Then there's Simon. His sweater is inspired by Gothic architecture and cathedrals, and he uses gray yarn and moss stitch to replicate the look of masonry and stonework. He creates a crochet stained glass insert, which doesn't end up working out due to time constraints. Di approaches Simon and says moss stitch is one of the most difficult stitches, at which point Sheila cuts her off and says, to do well. And this really struck me because moss stitch is actually one of the simplest stitches to knit. And I get where Di might be coming from here by bringing the yarn to the back and the front in between each stitch, like maybe gauge could be a challenge, but it does really start to undercut Di and Sheila's expertise because every knitter in the audience was probably saying, what are you talking about? Moss stitch isn't one of the hardest stitches, it's one of the simplest. After episode 1, many knitters were perplexed by the judging in the show. It wasn't hard to notice the judges were focusing mainly on color and aesthetics and avoiding mention of any technical details of the sweaters at all. It seemed strange, and it led to a contestant being sent home on week 1 who was doing very advanced skills. In episode 2, we do see a few more mentions of technical skills, but the focus still is mainly on color and aesthetics. Now, in defense of the judges, after my episode 1 recap video, Di came into my comment section, and she left a lot of comments in self-defense, explaining that she and Sheila had given hours of technical, detailed feedback to each participant of the show. But the edited team had removed all of that. Episode 1 only featured mention of color, not because Di and Sheila only gave judging on color, but because that's the only bit that made it to the final edit. And if that's true, the show isn't just failing its viewers, it is seriously misrepresenting its own experts. This show is going to live online for years, and the version of Di and Sheila that we get to see is not as expert knitters, but the judges who cried at a porthole and only talk about color. It's an extremely unflattering portrait to paint, and it seriously undermines their expertise. And then there's Holger. He creates a dog outfit inspired by Italian commedia dell'arte. For the second week in a row, Di is brought to tears by the beauty of one of the knitter's creations, and for the second week in a row, the knitter that made Di cry wins Big Knitter of the Week. Is this a pattern that we should start to notice? Is this a coincidence? Either way, I think it's a window into what the show values: emotional impact over technique. Ailsa makes a graffiti-inspired sweater based on the Duke of Wellington statue, which famously often has a traffic cone on its head, so she creates a tiny traffic cone hat to go along with her sweater. And she does something really innovative here. She uses a brush and brushes out the stitching to create a blown-out spray paint effect. This is super, super effective, and this is the type of innovation and creativity that I was hoping to see in this show. Knitters using techniques and approaches that make me say, whoa, I don't know if I ever would have thought of that, and it starts to make me think, how can I incorporate that into my knitting? Holger and Ailsa are clearly frontrunners in this competition. Dipti creates a rainbow unicorn sweater with a unicorn horn and a rainbow mane. Dipti begins to cry when the dog is modeling her sweater, and she says more than once, I'm crying because he's so beautiful, but I'm not convinced. I think that Dipti's tears, her emotional release, are more indicative of the incredible amount of stress it must create to be a novice competing against professionals like Holger and Ailsa in a televised competition that will be nationally shown. And it does make me wonder about why the casting directors decided to include novices alongside very experienced knitters in a show with the tagline, The Search for Britain's Best Knitter. Now, there were parts of this episode that were honestly pretty hard for me to watch, and that's because of Meadow's treatment. Now, we already know that Meadow is pretty young. She's 18, and she's painted as a new knitter. After episode 1, many knitters online noticed that Meadow appeared to be twisting her stitches in the panel she contributed to the group project. But in episode 2, the judges turn this into an on-screen discovery. Meadow creates a Freddie Mercury-inspired jacket. When the knitters are about halfway through the first challenge of knitting their dog sweater, the judges come up behind Meadow and they say, you seem to be twisting your stitches. Why did you make that choice? And she says, it's just the way that I knit. I didn't know that I was doing that. The judges explain to Meadow that twisting your stitches uses less yarn. It actually uses a little more yarn, and that it will pull in the fabric, resulting in an ill-fitting final garment. Meadow seems visibly flustered. My question is, if the judges saw her twisted stitches in episode 1, why did they wait to turn it into an on-screen drama in episode 2, rather than just pulling her aside and explaining to her in episode 1? And I think we all know the answer to this. The people behind the show aren't looking to truly represent the warmth and collaboration of the knitting community. They're trying to make a TV drama. Throughout the episode, you can see Meadow become more and more flustered. Meadow has to step outside, excuse herself from the barn entirely because she's feeling lightheaded. Now, Tom follows her, and to his credit, this is a very sweet and heartwarming moment. Everyone who's learned to knit has made mistakes, but they happen privately, not under studio lights to be broadcast to the nation. By the time that you are comforting a newish, young knitter who has had to excuse herself from the barn because the pressure and the stress has become so overwhelming, the damage is already done. And a responsible production team would have never cast Meadow, and for that matter, Dipti, if your tagline is Britain's Best Knitter and you knowingly put a young beginner up against seasoned designers, you start to see a show that prioritizes emotional strain for drama over the show's own tagline. Honestly, it made sense for Meadow to go home this week. I'm not upset that she was cast off. I'm upset that she was cast at all. The second challenge of the show is a group challenge. The participants are split into 3 groups of 3, and they're tasked with designing and knitting an 80s mohair jumper in just 10 hours. Team 1 is Simon, Dipti, and Isaac, and they create a balloon-inspired sweater. Team 2 is Holger, Tracy, and Lydia, and they create a pink and purple checkerboard sweater. And Team 3 is Stephanie, Ailsa, and Meadow, and they create a guitar music-inspired sweater. A post Holger shared on Instagram explained the team had to gauge swatch so the sweater would look cohesive, like only one knitter had made it, which is something the judges called out as a piece they really liked about the sweater. And Holger showed that when it was time to pivot and remove a sleeve from the sweater, they had to think fast, and Holger was able to repurpose his gauge swatch as part of the bow on the sleeve of the sweater, saving them valuable time. These are the technical details I would have loved to hear in the judging process. Yes, tell me about how the team had to swatch. Tell me about how they used that swatch to make the bow on the sweater. This is the type of innovation that knitters might want to use at home. In this challenge, not one single team was able to produce a sweater that had 2 sleeves. If your challenge is designed in such a way that not one team is able to finish it, there's a problem with the challenge. If a whole class fails a test, you don't assume that the whole class has a problem. You assume there's something wrong with the test. I already talked in my episode 1 video about how the time constraints in the show are truly physically punishing, but I think there's another layer here. Every knitter who's tried to sell something they handmade has heard, wait, why is it so expensive? The answer is because it took dozens and dozens of hours to knit. But the way that the show depicts knitting a sweater in just 10 to 12 hours sends a message that knitting is quick, low-skill labor. These time limits don't just stress out contestants and potentially lead to injury. They also send a message to the public about how long knitting takes, and it undermines every knitter who's trying to earn a fair wage for their hard work. After episode 1, Rowan released kits based on the designs of the Fair Isle vests created by the contestants in the competition. Those vests were based on personal stories and the identities of each knitter, and the knitters are not being compensated for those designs. Episode 2 escalates this because a Wool and the Gang kit appeared as soon as the episode aired so that you could make at home the pink and purple checkerboard sweater from challenge number 2. Now, Wool and the Gang has come forward and publicly stated that they are not compensating the designers directly. Their contract is with Channel 4, so they are compensating Channel 4 for the use of the designs and not the designers themselves. So I went ahead and reached out to Channel 4 to see if they were willing to confirm or deny whether they were compensating the designers directly. They said, the contributors whose designs were selected for the kits are fully aware that their designs are being used with a full credit to them and their work to allow viewers at home to knit along with the series. It's odd that they should say the full credit is given to the designers involved, because when I look at the landing page for both Rowan and Wool and the Gang's kits, only the first names of the designers involved in the project are used. And on the Game of Wool's official Instagram page, the participants are not being tagged in each post, so we can't even go back and find their personal pages. But when it comes to tagging the designers behind Tom Daley's high fashion looks in each episode, the show has no problem tagging them as collaborators on Instagram. For what it's worth, there has been a sea of comments and outrage among the knitting community that the designers involved in this project have not been paid for their designs in these kits. And yes, it's possible that they signed away their rights in their contracts, but it's still feels icky regardless. Now, contestants can't even talk about it. They're contractually barred from speaking to any media outlets, including creators like me, until every episode of the show has aired. Now, don't forget, Wool and the Gang is owned by the same private equity group as Rowan and Surtur. There is a direct pipeline between the Yarn in the Barn, these kits, and the Game of Wool show. It feels especially off to me, because a show titled The Game of Wool, that's being filmed in the UK, is selling out to private equity companies while Britain's own wool industry is in dire condition. As recently as 2024, British sheep farmers were literally burning their fleeces because it was cheaper than selling and shipping them. There are incredible British farmers and mills and heritage breeds that are fighting to survive right now, and this show could have spotlighted them, could have shouted them out. Instead, we have tie-in kits with global PE brands and AI-generated images of knitting. It's a real missed opportunity. So, did episode 2 get anything right? Is it better than episode 1? Right off the bat, yes. Dog sweaters are objectively a better choice than a chunky Fair Isle vest. It's something that a real hand knitter at home might actually want to make. There is slightly more technical language in this episode. Lace, mohair, and tarja. It still stays surface level, but it's a step in the right direction. And we get a peek into a little bit more creativity, like Ailsa's use of brushing out the letters for a graffiti look and Holger's tailored design. When you add in the extra details that we get from Instagram, like Holger using a swatch to create the bow, it starts to feel a little bit more like a fleshed out, detailed, juicy show that knitters were really hoping it would be. And to Channel 4's credit, they are clearly trying. Their YouTube Fair Isle explainer seemed like a direct response to knitters who were hoping for more history and detail about the craft, and they provided to us. It suggests that the people behind the show are actually listening to feedback. But the core problems still remain. The show doesn't know if it's about craft or content. The time limits are punishing and misleading, and displaying the creation of a garment in 10 to 12 hours undercuts hand knitters who are trying to earn a living wage from their craft. The editing still favors panic over process, the casting is ethically questionable, and the monetization is aggressive. But this is a reality TV show, and they need views to make money. So whether you love to watch it or hate to watch it, they're just happy you're watching it. Enjoy the show if you want to, but notice what it's saying about knitters and knitting. So yes, episode 2 is better than episode 1. The projects are stronger, the creativity's there, and we saw glimpses of the show this could be. But if the price of good television is burning out beginners, misrepresenting judges, and taking advantage of designers' IP to make profit from private equity, I'm just not sure if it's worth it. Next week's episode is swimsuits for Team GB and crocheted lawn chairs. I'll be watching, I'll be breaking it down again, because there is a great knitting show hiding under there, one that celebrates creativity and heritage and technique instead of panic. Until then, I'd love to hear from you. What would your ideal knitting competition look like? And do you think it's okay that they aren't compensating the designers for the patterns used in these kits? As always, it was really fun to talk about knitting with you today, and I can't wait to see you in the next one. Bye.